Good morning to everyone joining us, or afternoon if you're in Europe. Thank you for making time to hear a special presentation here from World Urban Parks. We're very fortunate today to have CJ Noble from Canada and Aaron Renn from here in the States to discuss really what's going on in our cities, from emerging cities to the industrialized, post-industrialized community. And this will be a little different webinar. You're not going to be besieged with slide decks for the upteenth time. This is going to be a roaming discussion between two super intelligent, articulate, and smart folks. Before we get them started, I do want to introduce and thank you for joining a World Urban Parks program. If you're not familiar with World Urban Parks, we're really a collaboration of folks from around the globe that work in the urban environment and have learned pretty quickly that we gain a lot more by talking together and across one another. And just as we saw how fast COVID and the pandemic sprang and raced across the globe, the good thing for us in the urban parks world is innovations, ideas, and creativity can move with that same speed. So if you're interested in engaging with that community, we'd love to have you in the discussion and the dialogue. This is the website down below to get more information, or you can follow us on any of those social media platforms as well. Coming up for World Urban Parks are a couple big things. One is our global conference that obviously will be virtual. That will be emanating from Tirana, Albania. That will be at the end of November, so look for that shortly. And then this webinar is part of a series put on by the North American Committee. So we do one of these each month. And our next program will be in October, and it'll be featuring a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy, the National Institutes of Health here in the States, New York University, and University of Louisville. That's called the Green Heart Program, Understanding Urban Ecology. And we'll give you information on that at the close of CJ and Aaron's time. Want to do my intros here for our two speakers. Our convener is CJ Noble, who I've now known for almost a couple years. Love CJ's work because unlike a lot of us in the parks world, and I hope she doesn't discount this, she has a broader, really, view of the world. She has been in the federal government in Canada, both supporting cabinet ministers and secretaries across rural development and the urban setting, and in the agriculture industry, which I think is absolutely fascinating as we think about the urban-rural construct and the economies that undergird both. And then our speaker, of course, and we're very fortunate, thank you, Aaron, for making time for this, has been one of the most provocative thinkers. I've enjoyed reading his work for years, so I'm a fanboy through City Journal and then through Governing Magazine, as he has really helped us think about how cities function. And what I love particularly about Aaron, and I know he's hearing this, so I hate saying good things about him, but he brings a very unique perspective as someone who created jobs, who was an innovator before entering the public sector and really the intellectual side of city development. So he brings a really neat perspective that I know he's going to flesh out today, which is where does all the money come from? Where do the people come from that then we try to serve through our urban park systems? And the truth is, there's a lot of jobs and private wealth that have to drive things before we can even show up to do our work. And so that's why we thought this discussion would be very interesting. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screens and I will shut the heck up because you're already tired of hearing from me, and turn it over to CJ and Aaron. Thank you both so very much.
Thanks, Scott, and welcome to all the participants, and thank you for taking time out of what I know are very busy days right now amid the pandemic to participate today. And despite the pandemic, the big issues our sector was facing and working on prior to COVID, they didn't disappear. So it's important to pause from the immediate crisis and continue our work and our conversations on those big issues that were there before and will be there again after the pandemic. Today's conversation, I think, is going to challenge you to think outside the box a bit for the next hour. And I encourage you to give yourself permission to step outside your daily work, step outside the immediate crisis, and step outside the pandemic for just the next hour, and embrace the opportunity for a holistic thought process. And I think Aaron will help us harness a wider definition of the parks community and take our blinders off and look a bit more wide about who is in that parks community and how it's influencing it. So I encourage you to give open minds to Aaron's presentation, approach our discussion that we'll have afterwards with curiosity. Aaron's going to take us on a journey to look at the state of the world's cities and the different dynamics and implication for parks in two segments of both the developing world and the developed world. So before I hand it over to Aaron, I just wanted to let you know that Aaron will probably speak for about 30 minutes because we wanted to leave a lot of time for conversation, discussion, and questions. So if you have questions that pop up in your mind as Aaron's speaking, feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be monitoring those, and I will present those to Aaron at the end of his presentation. So again, thank you, and please sit back and enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My understanding is that we have a global audience that attends these, probably a mix of people from the developed world and the developing world. And because the dynamics are very different in those places, I'm going to give essentially two mini talks, kind of one focused on each of those segments. And as was said in the intro, I am not a parks designer. I come at this from a little bit of a different perspective. I tend to focus on kind of more general urbanism, often in post-industrial cities of the world. A lot of work on demographic analysis and economic development and transportation infrastructure. A lot of focus on attracting talent, economic competitiveness, et cetera. And so a lot of the slides and things that I would ordinarily put up would be more management consulting slides because that's my background, rather than the kind of very cool visualizations that you all do. So I decided to mercifully not do a slide presentation and just talk to you today. And so first we're going to talk a little bit about the developing world. First just reviewing some things that probably a lot of you already know, which is that we are in the midst of the most profound demographic and cultural shift in the history of humanity, which is namely the shift of going from living a rural village existence to an urban existence. And when we think about history, I think it can be misleading because we often think about the great cities of history, Athens, Babylon, Rome, maybe even Paris during the time of Napoleon or something like that. But the reality is, until very recently, almost nobody lived in cities. 100 years ago, the planet was only 10% urban. So into the 20th century, we were a 90% rural planet. Today, we're over 50% urban. And I saw the slide from the cover of the Endless City up there. It has the stat that, by mid-century, we'll be 75% urban globally. And by the end of this century, humanity will have completed the shift of going from living in almost entirely rural village existence to an almost entirely urban one. This in the span of only about 200 years. Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Romer likens this to humanity going from living like packs of wolves to living more like ants or termites. And while that's not exactly maybe an appetizing image, I think it does go to show you the radical nature of this shift in the way that we're living. And to try to put a little bit of color on it, according to China Daily, over the next 10 to 20 years, there are going to be an additional 400 million urban residents in China. That's more than the entire population of the United States. China has had a strategy of deliberate urbanization, but even in places like India, where that's not been the case, the UN is projecting 300 million new urban residents by 2050. Africa is also seeing a lot of urbanization. In fact, Africa is poised to dominate the globe in terms of population growth in coming decades. There are about 1.2 billion people there today. The UN midpoint projection will be about doubling by 2050. And a lot of that growth, not all of it by any means, but a lot of that growth is actually going to be urban. And so not only has the total number of people dwelling in urban areas grown, but the size of cities has grown tremendously compared to historical eras. In 1800, there was only one city in the entire world with 1 million people in it, which was Beijing. And occasionally throughout history, you will see historians say that, well, maybe there were 1 million people in Rome at its imperial peak. But in fact, most cities around the world were small cities or even small towns by our standards. You know, some people estimate classical Athens had like 100,000 people in it. Well, today there are over 50 cities in the United States with more than 1 million people in the regional populations, which is the best way to look at it, which shows you that now we've got essentially what would have been giant imperial capitals all over the place in the world. And today there are now cities on a scale nobody in history could have imagined. There's a term called megacities that refers to cities with more than 10 million people in them. These basically never existed in world history until extremely recently. In 1950, there were only 2 megacities in the entire world, New York and Tokyo. But today, demographer Wendell Cox estimates that there are 37 cities in the world with more than 10 million people. The largest city in the world is Tokyo with 38 million people. And there are a lot more of these cities coming. So obviously keeping up with this growth in cities and megacities around the world is an enormous challenge. A McKinsey consulting study from a few years ago estimated that in just the top 600 cities in the world, there would need to be an additional investment of $10 trillion per year in physical capital just to keep up with growth. By physical capital, housing, buildings, infrastructure, you know, water, sewer, roads, and of course parks, just to keep up with the growth. That's not to serve any of the existing people that are there. So that's the equivalent of spending half the economic output of the entire United States every year just to keep up with urban growth around the world in terms of physical infrastructure. And that's a big problem because a lot of these new cities and megacities are in the developing world and don't have a lot of resources. And this includes places like Jakarta with 32 million people, Manila with 24 million, Karachi with 24 million, Dhaka, 17 million, Kinshasa, 12 million. And most Americans, frankly, don't even know where these cities are and may never have heard of them. You know, what country is Karachi in even? It's in Pakistan, by the way, but it's like, you know, half the people never heard of these places, and yet they're bigger than all cities in the US, except maybe New York and LA. And, you know, it's a real question as to whether or not a lot of these places will ever be able to turn the corner to create kind of first world services and service levels. Historically, urbanization went hand in hand with economic growth and transformation. So we can think about this historically in the United States. As we urbanized, we were industrializing, we were building water and sewer systems, we were implementing indoor plumbing, electrification, building great park systems. We see the same thing that's happening today in China. As China is urbanizing, it's been industrializing, its economy has grown enormously, and it's really been able to invest in, you know, world-class public transportation, many amenities. But today, in a lot of places, we see urbanization without growth or without significant growth. And that's creating a big challenges. For example, you know, according to the UN, there are 900 million people in the world living in slums today. And that's bigger than the entire population of the United States and the EU put together. So that's like a huge, huge, huge issue. And so these are kind of the trends bearing down on the majority of the world's population. And so what does this have to do with parks? You might ask, and it actually has a lot to do with parks. I mentioned Paul Romer earlier, and he did a lot of thinking about the developing world and growth in the developing world. He's like, what is the most important thing to get right up front when this urbanization starts to happen? Because obviously you can't do everything, particularly in developing world countries. I mean, we don't have $10 trillion a year to spend on this. And so what do you spend your money on? What do you focus on? And if you think of it that way, you would think that, well, probably, you know, water, sewers, sanitation, things of that nature would probably be at the top, and that parks might actually rank, you know, somewhere near the bottom, looking at some of these things. But that's actually not the case at all. Romer came to the conclusion that there are basically 2 things you need to get right up front. One of them was getting the underlying civic and cultural rules right in these cities, because once they're established, they're extremely difficult, sometimes impossible to change. I think, for example, in the United States, there's a lot of debate today over the Electoral College. That was something that was put in place at the founding of the country, and it's the kind of thing that becomes extremely difficult to ever change. So you have to think a lot about how the rule systems get set up front, because those are incredibly persistent. The other thing, however, was to set aside and reserve public spaces. And a lot of what he was thinking about here was streets and roads, but it also applies to parks. Similarly to the, to the thing about rules. Once you develop a city, it is now all but impossible to go back later and get needed space for development after the facts. Yes, in Paris, right back in the 1800s, they were able to bulldoze huge tracts of the city in order to build boulevards. That's not nearly as easy to do today. And Romer cites the example, a positive example, of the 1811 Commissioner's Plan of New York, which laid out a grid of streets along all of Manhattan at a time when it was almost entirely farm fields. They're like, as development comes, we have to have streets laid out so that this thing doesn't turn into complete chaos. And that created the architecture that turned New York into essentially the world's wealthiest and most commercially prosperous cities. And similarly, New York was able to allocate the land for Central Park before the city was completely built out. Central Park was not part of that original commissioner's plan. It was added later. And there certainly were people living and there were buildings where Central Park is today, but it was not really fully developed. It was still at that point feasible to do the land acquisition and do the the relocations in order to build Central Park. And if New York had not built Central Park when they did, the window of opportunity to have developed that would have been forever foreclosed. It would have been completely impossible to ever develop a park like that in New York today if all of that land were developed. And we can actually see that by looking at Lower Manhattan below 59th Street, which is severely underparked. There are relatively few parks in Manhattan below 96th Street, even though it is one of the world's wealthiest cities. The land is so valuable, even today, New York cannot afford to create new park space, essentially. So if you look at how they're creating parks, they're trying to do it through like reclaiming industrial space along the waterfront. But most of what's being done is essentially requiring developers to build some sort of public space in exchange for density bonuses on buildings. So they've created a lot of what they call privately owned public spaces, or POPs. Most of those are really plazas, though. They're not parks. Although I believe Zuccotti Park, which was the home of Occupy Wall Street, is actually one of these POPs. But they're not genuine public spaces, and the rights of the public are more limited there, as happened. But so even New York didn't have enough parks in parts of the city, but they were able to set this aside earlier. And so this makes the setting aside of land at the time of initial urbanization one of the most strategically important things cities need to do. And because of this extreme difficulty of getting land after the facts, the actions that we take today as urbanization is happening over the next few decades are going to determine how millions and millions and millions of people are going to live in those places basically forever, or potentially for an extremely long time. Because once development, including even informal development, is built in these places, it's just going to be impossible to come back later and say, now we're ready to build the parks. You won't be able to get the land for parks. So you don't have to build any actual parks today, but you at least have to reserve and set aside land that is in strategic places for parks, as well as for streets and things like that. Well, how do we do that? Well, that's the challenge. It's extremely difficult. The dynamics vary from place to place. The only practical tip that I would really give on this is if you're ever in a position of influence in one of those cities or countries or regions, to be able to get someone like Paul Romer to come in and talk to the prime minister or talk to the local leaders. He's actually done a lot of consulting around the world on this. I would do it. Now that he has a Nobel Prize, he's even more credible and perhaps influential than he would have been before. But I think this is really going to determine, the future, quality of life forever in some of these places that are rapidly growing. And so that's really what I wanted to say about the developing world. Just to kind of set up that big challenge, because I think it is one of humanity's big challenges to respond to that globalization. And I want to talk about the developed world a little bit. And I'm really going to focus on the United States here. I think the same basic problem that I'm going to talk about, I think, is applicable to much of the rest of the developed world. But as we know, the structure of local government varies enormously from country to country. And so the exact dynamics of who's in charge of what and the fiscal regimes are different. But I think a lot of the issues around austerity are places that I think they're hitting essentially every developed country in the world. And I think the most important thing to understand about the United States and many of the development countries is that we've long been essentially fully urbanized. We like to make these distinctions between urban and suburban, but suburban growth is really just another form of urban growth. It's an automobile-oriented form of urban growth, and it's actually classified as urban space by the Census Bureau. So the United States is about 80% urban today in terms of its population, and we hit 50% urban way back in 1920. So this transition that the developing world is going through today is something that we went through a long time ago. And, I think a lot of people like to conflate those, mayors in the US like to tout some of these statistics that I told you about the world, and then sort of act like, the city is where it's at, the city's where it's happening. And I think we do really need to keep those separate. The dynamics in sort of the mature, developed world economies, countries are a little bit different than what is happening in some of this rapid urbanization in the developed world. And I look at, since we've already had this major set of urbanization in the US, I look back and I think, we did a pretty decent job of setting aside land for parks. Not perfect. I mentioned Lower Manhattan earlier, which is very, very, very underparked, but decent. And, we managed to really create some superb park systems in the United States designed by people like Frederick Law Olmsted. A lot of our challenges relate to maintaining what we have. And one of the reasons that we have this challenge is that we went through an extended period of urban decline in this country. If we think back to what you might call as the Rust Belt era that hit its low point in the 1970s and the 1980s, it was a very bleak time for cities. It wasn't a good time in London either, by the way. A lot of other countries were going through similar dynamics. But in the United States, we really had this acute period in which it looked like cities were going to go down the tubes. In the 70s in Seattle, someone put up a billboard that's still pretty famous today. It says, "Will the last one leaving Seattle please turn out the lights?" You can Google it if you want to see what it looks like. The Chicago Tribune in 1981 did a 4-part front page series called "The City on the Brink," basically arguing that Chicago was about to completely go down the tubes. New York nearly went bankrupt in the 1970s. Back then you didn't even want to go in the parks in the daytime. And even as recently as 1990, Time magazine did a cover story called "The Rotting of the Big Apple." And this was an era, again, of enormous murder rates. It was height of like drug epidemics, tremendous police corruption, many problems there. Today, I think, is what a tremendous difference that has happened is there's been essentially a resurgence of the city in many places. The cities, the core municipality, not just the entire region, but the core municipalities of New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco are at or very near all-time population highs. Places like Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. have rebounded from decades of population loss and are now actually growing in population again. for the first time in a long time. And this is true economically, not just in terms of population. So New York City pre-COVID had been at an all-time job high as well, despite losing something like 90% of all the manufacturing jobs that used to really power New York. It was more than replaced by service industries and finance and high tech and the arts, et cetera. And so we reached a place, I think, in a lot of these cities where the problems that were facing them were no longer the problems of decline, but they were the problems of success, notably high housing prices, which was causing a lot of crises. And of course, this is not true everywhere. There are a lot of cities in the United States, Flint, Michigan, much of upstate New York, Youngstown, Dayton, Birmingham, places like Gary, Indiana, that remain deeply, deeply troubled and have been bypassed by the urban renaissance. But certainly there have been a very large number of places that really also have benefited from it, including second tier cities like Indianapolis, where I live today. But there's still a problem in these places, both in the cities that remain stuck in a kind of a challenging spot, as well as those that have had even very, very strong recoveries. And that is that they still remain very fiscally constrained, right? And this has been at a time that they continue to have very large infrastructure investment deficits as a result of, essentially decades of decline. They accumulated an enormous burden of needed infrastructure investments. So think about a place, New York, like New York City, incredibly prosperous, yet has subway signals that are still based on 1930s technology. Think about these decrepit water and sewer systems that places have. There's still a lot of cities that use lead water pipes, which can cause poisoning, especially for children, that can retard, brain development. So it's really a very toxic substance for children. But there are still cities, and you can Google this if you want to see examples, that still actually have wooden service pipes under the street. So in essence, we built all this infrastructure initially, and then we've sort of been sweating the assets for a very long period of time. And this applies to our park systems, which have often accumulated significant amounts of needed maintenance and upgrades. Even New York City, which has invested a ton of money in parks, there are a lot of outer borough parks that are not in great shape. I visited them and I said, this place needs some money to be spent on it. And so this was even the case pre-COVID in places that were very prosperous. And the coronavirus has done, I think, a couple of things relevant to our discussion today. The first is that it really showed how important urban parks are. I mean, I used to live in New York, again, so I know a lot about it. I also live in Indianapolis today. I spent most of the coronavirus here in Indy. And I can tell you our parks have just been so busy. And that's the story that we hear everywhere, particularly when the stores and everything were closed. People wanted to get out. They wanted to be able to engage, with the city and with nature, kind of in a safe way. And so we've seen incredible surges in park usage during the coronavirus. In some respects, it's a golden age for parks here in Indianapolis and across the country. But the second thing that the coronavirus is going to do, it is going to have a severe negative effect on municipal budgets that are already under significant strain pre-coronavirus. And again, I think this is something that has been applicable around the world as people have talked about austerity, and that in essence, we have been locked in, particularly at local levels in many places, into a very, very, very constrained environment in which a lot of government budgets have not yet or have just barely recovered from the Great Recession. And so this means realistically, there is going to be less public funding available for parks in the future. Again, as a backdrop being that, we already were underfunded. And so that means cities are going to have to find even more new and creative ways to raise money for parks. And I think part of the equation is going to be a much more extensive use of the public-private partnership model that's already proven itself in a number of examples. And this was really, I think, pioneered in a contemporary sense in New York with its Conservancy model. In the 1980s, there were two key organizations created, the Bryant Park Restoration Corporation and the Central Park Conservancy, that essentially took over failing parks. Bryant Park was known as Needle Park because it was so infested with drug users and dealers. Central Park, you've probably seen the pictures of Central Park as kind of a dust bowl. And in both cases, these restorations of these parks involved a mix of public and privately raised money, but I think both of them are now largely supported by private sector models. And this has been a very controversial model for a number of reasons. One is that some people are just philosophically opposed to private sector involvement in parks. They just don't believe in it. Others object to commercial activities in park spaces, and most of these Conservancy nonprofit managed, privately nonprofit managed parks do incorporate commercial uses into the park as one of their funding streams. And then others object that it creates a two-tier park system where essentially wealthy people around Central Park are able to build, fabulous parks for themselves and leaving everyone else kind of out in the cold. And I think, these are all, I think, in essence, very valid arguments that you can make in terms of this. There are always going to be trade-offs in everything that we do. I think what we need to look at is, contrast that with what the alternative models were. And I think in New York, these have been very positive and successful overall. Bryant Park is frankly just superb and continues to be like on the leading edge, I think. And I think one of the things that this Conservancy model, this nonprofit model did, besides raising money, is that it created a buffer or a layer of political risk insulation for elected officials. So Bryant Park Restoration Corporation could take risks in the park that an elected official would not be able to take because of the political risk. So, it would let the city beat up on the nonprofit if it didn't go well and sort of be the punching bag. And so we saw a ton of not just, financial innovation out of Bryant Park. We saw a tremendous amount of innovation in how parks are actually designed and managed. Although the newspaper business, for example, is kind of going down today in print, you're probably familiar with all those large multi-paper integrated news racks that a lot of cities installed in their downtowns that replace this jumble of individual news racks scattered all over the street. Those were invented for the streets around Bryant Park. Bryant Park Restoration Corporation invented those. Similarly, they really pioneered the contemporary fad for showing films in a summer film series in the park. And they also implemented a lot of the ideas of the great William H. White, who did a lot of really thorough research around what makes for successful urban spaces. One of them, for example, are these movable bistro chairs that a lot of people now just call Bryant Park chairs that are now basically ubiquitous. You go to almost any new urban park today, they've got those Bryant Park tables and chairs, but they figured out how to do that. And there's actually a very good book that just came out, by the way, called Learning from Bryant Park by Andrew Manshell, who was involved in that whole process. And so these were really, I think, sources of innovation as well. Mayor de Blasio in New York early on made noises about wanting to essentially tax the wealthier park conservancies in order to have them contribute funds that would be redistributed to parks and poor areas. And this didn't fly politically there, but I do think this is not necessarily a bad idea conceptually. And I think we ought to look about ways to create bargains that accomplish similar things, right? How do we get wealthier areas to pay up, maybe that lets them have a very nice park, but to do this in a way that allows them to contribute funds or create a net increase in funds that can be put into lower income areas. And I think there's a lot of ways that we could potentially do this. One, rather than taxing these conservancies, why not just ask them to take on responsibilities for other parks that don't have as much revenue generating capacity? This would only work if there were suitable, neighborhood parks geographically proximate. You couldn't ask the Central Park Conservancy to easily take on responsibility for a park in the, far reaches of Queens or something. But there are a number of small parks in lower income areas in Manhattan that maybe they could just provide some management. Maybe some of their management, their crews, their equipment could be used. Even if they didn't pay for the whole thing, they could leverage all the infrastructure they've built to help it. So I think looking at ways to extend them in that direction. And the other thing that I think we ought to do much, much more of as a city is to use public capital dollars as a lever or an incentive to get neighborhoods to agree to take over some of their own park maintenance. Cities today do spend money on capital, and I think, while there's always some money spread around, I think it's generally the case that they concentrate their investments in specific neighborhoods that they think have high potential for growth or for turning around. And no surprise, many of these neighborhoods in these near downtown areas that have been the recipients of enormous public investment have now become very high income and are very successful. And while the property values went up and thus the tax revenues would go up, I think in essence, the city did not get nearly enough in return from those neighborhoods, in considering how much money has been involved in them. So I think cities ought to think very strategically about, if we're making an investment in an area, how do we use, particularly these higher income areas, how do we use that as an incentive to get things like, for example, upzoning, where the city could permit higher density development, maybe around a park that it's going to renovate and turn into this great show place. Well, we want more people to be able to take advantage of that so we can have higher density developments, which are often opposed in many of these places. And that would, again, raise incremental tax revenue. And the same thing, you say, look, we'll build this park, but you have to agree to create a special taxing district, which could be structured like a business improvement district, but may include residential properties as well. I think it's fair to include residential properties if you're building an amenity for residential community, and say, you guys have to pay to run and maintain this over time. We'll build it for you, and we do that. Obviously, you can't say that in a lower income community, but I think it's the sort of thing we should be looking at in higher income communities, which frankly are benefiting disproportionately from public investment. Here in Indianapolis, about a decade ago, there was a capital investment program called Rebuild Indy. There was hundreds of millions of dollars that was spent, and it did investment all over the city. And this is exactly the sort of program that could have been used, but was not, in order to bring these neighborhoods in these wealthier areas to the table and get them to contribute back to the pie. So it's like, hey, we're going to invest and we're going to completely transform this park in your neighborhood, and in return, you're going to agree to upzone it, and we're going to use tax increment financing to capture some of the future tax growth from that. That's going to help pay off the bonds for this park. Oh, and by the way, we're also going to manage this through a public-private partnership with some commercial activity, and you will have a special neighborhood taxing district that is going to finance the operations and maintenance of this park. And I think the key to me is, like, how can we get some of these parks in some of these higher income neighborhoods essentially off the books of the city financially, not sell the park soft to private developers or cede the public oversight over them, but to get some of these areas to essentially take over for their own amenities for the express purpose of enabling the core parks budget to be reinvested into lower income neighborhoods and drive improvements there. And so, again, I don't think that's a perfect solution. I think in an ideal world, we would have, plenty of money to maintain and operate parks through the public all throughout the city. Unfortunately, we're just not in that case. And so I think as we go into a place where certainly we're entering, we don't know what's going to happen in the federal election. There could be, some type of massive stimulus for local governments. It could happen. I'm not saying it couldn't. I think realistically, we're going to be in a period of, again, renewed austerity fiscally in a lot of these cities. And parks and streets are some of the easiest things to cut because you could just skimp on the maintenance and kind of kick the can down the road. They're not going to crumble immediately, and then you build up these massive infrastructure deficits. So I think that is really, I think getting creative about the financial model and being much more open to private sector participation at scale, I think is going to be very important to keeping up the supply of funds for urban parks in the United States. So I think with that, I will conclude and turn it back over to you, CJ.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. That was really interesting. And I thought I want to remind people, if they have questions, you can put them in the Q&A section that's at the bottom of your screen, or you can also put them in the chat. And as our participants put some of their questions together, I thought I would start off, Aaron, with reflecting on what you were saying, like once a city's developed, it's too late or next to impossible to be able to carve park space out for it. And I was reflecting on a park that is being built in Toronto. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called Rail Deck Park. And it's right in downtown Toronto. What they've done is take a giant bridge that used to be part of the corridor for the railways, and they're building it into a park. And so I didn't know if you knew much about that and wanted to speak to it, or if you had some other examples down in the US of like super innovative ways that they're trying to turn it around so it's not too late to include that.
Yeah, I think what we are seeing in kind of the developed world, people are looking to reclaim spaces that were allocated to other uses that are no longer necessary. So the High Line in New York is a good example. It was an old abandoned rail line. It sounds like that the Toronto project is something similar. I think was it Seoul did something similar? Like, did they remove a freeway and then daylighted this old stream under it? So I think freeway decommissionings, roadway decommissionings in some of these cities might make some sense. Akron, Ohio they were planning to plow an interstate all the way through downtown, and they built part of it, and then they ran out of money. So there was just a spur coming into their downtown that was really superfluous and not needed. And so they've closed that. And I don't know exactly what they're going to do with that land. They don't necessarily have money to redevelop it, but they now have this land available that was not there before. Old industrial properties along waterfronts. Scott's doing that project down in southern Indiana near Louisville. It was land that was largely, was floodplain. It was sort of derelict in a lot of ways, underutilized. It had never been developed for that. And so that's available. So I do think looking at creative ways to reclaim space from infrastructure, from old infrastructure that you're decommissioning, maybe it's a building, it is in part, maybe there's like an old, sort of in Chicago, there's a huge site where there used to be a hospital called Michael Reese Hospital. It's down along the lakefront on the south side. There's probably going to be some sort of redevelopment of that site for mixed use development, but can you set aside part of that for additional park space? So I think there are ways to incrementally reclaim space. And I think looking at old elevated bridges, old elevated railways, old industrial waterfront, Toronto's got some of that, and as well, and thinking about how to do it. And sometimes you got to like take the land where it's available. It's not all necessarily where you want it, but sometimes old rail and freeway lines can be done that. Atlanta's doing something like that with the Beltline Park. There was an old rail loop that circled the city. So I think there are opportunities to find incremental space, but they tend to be extremely costly projects in general. And so it would be better if you didn't have to have these extremely expensive reclamation projects. But I do think looking creatively, and even if you're going to redevelop a site, how can you carve out some of that for park space, I think is important.
Great. And I notice Mark Camley from London has shared on the chat that they've used the opportunity of the 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games to create a 560 acre new park by purchasing industrial lands and cleaning it up.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example, you know, and something like the Olympics, again, you're making this sort of, you know, I think that's a good example. You have some major civic strategic engagement. How do you take something like the Olympics as well and leverage that to reclaim land for parks? You know, one of the things that was done in New York, this isn't per se a parks matter, but you know, the bid they lost to London on the Olympics ended up turning into the development site that's now Hudson Yards, where they extended a public transit line into an area of Manhattan that had very poor transit access. Believe it or not, there are parts of Manhattan with poor transit access. And so that's kickstarted a lot of development over there. So when you have these, like, that's another, I think, great example of you have a major event. Could be in the United States context, maybe it's hosting a Super Bowl or something where they like to do these legacy projects and thinking about, okay, we're making this major civic investment. We have an opportunity to mobilize large amounts of funds. How do we leverage that funding to build it? And again, also, I think going back to the second part of the presentation, you not only have to think about how do we build it, but how do we put in place a structure that will operate and maintain it over the long term? Because it's very attractive in the United States for mayors to want to cut the ribbon on something new, but you know, keeping it up, maintaining it is not nearly as sexy, and that's where places you know, kind of often fall down on the job.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Mark also noted an airport in Saudi Arabia, another one. I guess, Aaron, I also wanted to ask, as you spoke about how it's important for developing countries to reserve public space, and as we said, for more developed cities to reclaim space, in the context of COVID-19 and the fact that this will probably not be the last pandemic we face globally, do you have any thoughts on how you build, or what people need to be thinking about when they're building what I would call pandemic resilient parks? And if things really need to change in order to address what's going on now, but more future pandemics?
That's an interesting one. You know, I haven't spent too much time thinking specifically about how you would design a park. I think it does show that having, you know, there's no substitute for park acreage when you need to have, you know, increasing numbers of people using a park and yet maintaining kind of, you know, social distance or physical distance from each other. So I think it does show the importance of, you know, having parks within convenient distance of the population, and just having, you know, frankly, enough park acreage. I'm sure there are all these ratios that your profession has about how much park space per capita that you need in the city, you know, how the distance is, et cetera. You know, maybe there ought to be, you know, more thought put into, are those sufficient? Or do you need to have actually more park space? And, you know, this might be something that can be more readily developed or more readily thought about in maybe suburban communities that are expanding and growing as they're planning it out. Maybe they should be planning for more park space, more parks and more park space than they currently are today. Because that's where the growth in a lot of the growth in greenfield development is occurring in the U.S.
Right, thank you. As I wait for questions from our participants, I also wanted to go at the very beginning when you were speaking about the demographic shift that's happening around the world in regard to more and more people moving to urban centers. I wanted to, given my rural background, turn it a bit and ask you your thoughts on how we ensure that the minority population that remains in rural communities because of the need to work in natural resources. Some of our indigenous people will remain in rural spaces and communities. And when you have only so much money as a country or a state, how you ensure that those people in rural and remote areas are still going to receive appropriate services in the area of parks.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. I grew up in a very rural area of the United States. My town where my post office was located had about 50 people in it. And, I was about 4 miles outside of town, and for a while lived kind of in a trailer on a gravel road. And so I think about it more in terms of that experience. I think some of the ideas of urban parks that you need to have more contact with nature, for example, are less important in some of these areas. I think parks in that kind of context often becomes about wildlife and habitat preservation, more kind of like, call it national parks or forests or things of that nature. We had plenty of contacts with nature. What I would say that often people don't have is, for example, like playground equipment for children and things like that. So I do think that, like, making sure, that there are actually kind of like playgrounds that are accessible. Again, I think about it more, I think about this more in a developed world context. I'm not sure exactly what a rural person in some of these parts of the world is going to want. So I don't want to project my desires onto them. But I would say, right, when they built a county park near me when I was growing up, and it had a swimming pool, and I was there all the time. So having something that does have a facility of some sort, more so than just raw green space, because you typically have, I think, a lot of the green space already.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. I have a question from Nadine Melanson LeBlanc, and I'll just read it out here. When planning and designing park spaces, public engagement is key, as they will become the users of this space. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts or examples on how to best achieve public engagement during a pandemic situation?
Yeah, it's a challenge. When I think about it, I think the public engagement in general is a challenge, because generally only a limited set of the community is motivated to engage. They're often not representative of the community as a whole. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the process in general. One of the things that I think about in general with engagement, I think New York City did a very good job with this on their on some of their street redesigns. Is they did a lot of like they called it trial. We're going to close Times Square to traffic with some buckets of paint and a few barrels, and we're going to put out some lawn chairs that we bought at a hardware store, and we're just going to let people engage with the space. So I think if there's some kind of a design, if there's some way to sort of like create interactive ways to integrate with the design, maybe in an actual park, I think that could be good. Maybe there's not a traditional public hearing, or there's a Zoom public hearing, but maybe we're doing something actually in a park, programming an activity where, there's like a little simulated something that people can play around with it. I think the public engagement is really challenging. It's even, it's challenging for me. I look at these plans and I'm like, it's very hard for me to even envision how this place is going to function. I do think in general, public engagement is an area that needs a lot of thought. We're having to increasingly, and this because we have declining civic participation in so many dimensions of society here in the United States. Anyway, it's like, turnout in municipal elections, for example, in the United States is abysmal. And so, figuring out how to re-engage the citizenry is a big issue just across the board. It's a challenge I don't pretend to have all the answers to.
Thanks. I think we have time for a couple more questions. I'll ask one, and then if any of the participants have one, just send it my way. and then I'll turn it over to Scott. So I guess just to unpack a bit more, Aaron, what you were speaking about in regard to thinking outside the box of how parks can be funded. When you're speaking about private sector funding of parks, what do you see as the risk, or what do you hear folks view as the biggest risk? And what do you say to folks to calm those concerns so they're able to look at that option without so much trepidation?
Yeah, I think there's, I mean, again, I think a lot of the opposition to this is really, it's motivated by those other concerns I think I mentioned earlier. I think a lot of the opposition is really just philosophical. You know, it's like sometimes, it's like in New York, there was a proposal for putting tolls on the East River bridges in order to implement congestion pricing. And, the Queensboro president was just like, I just don't believe in that. So it's like, I don't believe that we should be charging people to come into Manhattan. And so I think sometimes we try to like have this idea that we just gonna all get along. But sometimes there are kind of like substantive disagreements. And, I think, I do think you have to build enough of a civic consensus, but I don't think you're ever gonna get anyone on board. I think a risk, one of the people in the Q&A just put in a risk is that, these privately funded parks can become vulnerable to their own uncertain income thing. And that's clearly going to be the case. That's clearly going to be the case in some areas today, is that, if wealthy people leave Manhattan and they're not funding these parks anymore, it certainly becomes vulnerable. One of the things that I like, I like to do, to the extent that you can, and something that was done here for a project called the Indy Cultural Trail, which is essentially a linear park. We took 8 miles of streets in our downtown and converted them into essentially a bicycling and pedestrian path with, all this integrated landscaping parts, kind of like a High Line thing, but at grade. Very expensive, but they basically took the thing as we're going to build an endowment, and this endowment is going to give us some cover, to generate a sustainable source of income. Just like arts organizations, I think, very much always wanted to have some percentage of their budget covered by an endowment. That's obviously not going to be building an endowment that would cover enough of Central Park's budget. I don't know how feasible that is, but when you first build something, the guy who is running this cultural trail project, who's the head of a local foundation, he's like, I will not physically complete this trail until we have raised the endowment money. Even if I have all the money for construction raised, we're not going to build the last segments until we have raised the money that we want to raise for an endowment. And now there are some museums that sort of take that price too. We're not actually going to build this new exhibit until we've not only raised the cost of this new exhibit wing, but we have raised the endowment to actually fund the operations and maintenance of this thing. So certainly if you're building something new, building some sort of an endowed structure into it up front, I think is there. I think Kalamazoo, Michigan, by the way, is a bunch of rich people in Kalamazoo were looking at creating private endowments to fund city government and city services. There's some very wealthy people in Kalamazoo, and they're like, what if we created a $500 million foundation with all of our money to fund city services? And again, I don't think that's an ideal scenario by any means, because you don't want to be dependent on the generosity of a handful of very wealthy donors. But it's the sorts of things I think are going to be more, prevalent. So looking to do what some of these, arts organizations and things do around endowments, if you can do it up front, is helpful.
Great, thanks, Aaron, and thank you, Peter. I see you have a question in the Q&A session, but we do need to wrap up, so I want to let you know that we will have this recording available shortly, and Peter will make sure that we answer your question within that message that we send out. So I'm going to turn it over to Scott just to tell you about some more events coming up. But I did want to take a minute to thank you, Aaron. I know that you're probably as busy as all of us during this crazy time. So thank you for taking time. Thank you to all the participants, and thank you to the organizers, the Epley Institute, the World Parks Academy, and World Urban Parks. And I'll just turn it over to Scott now to wrap us up.
Great. So appreciate everyone's time. I do want to let you know that you will be getting this list of books that come from this if you want to chase more of these ideas out. So look for that to come in the mailing that you'll get from Maggie. And then we're useless if we don't have a playlist as well. So there's a playlist that goes with the talk. And I promise Starships We Built This City is not on that playlist. Next, for coming up for the World Urban Parks, I mentioned in October 22nd, there'll be a program on the Green Heart, some cutting edge research from the academic community about what's working and what's not working in our cities in terms of making them more livable. We'll have folks from both Louisville, NYU, and NIH on that call, and we'll get that information posted. If you'd like to register for it now, the link is on the bottom. We'll extend that in the notes afterwards, and that'll be on October 22nd. So with that, thank everyone for your time. I think we're holding to our calendar, and we will see you all again. Stay safe. Bye-bye.